expression. Welcome to the next seminar in the CMDR seminar series with Dr. Marcus Grohmann. So I will introduce him in a minute. Just to say that we do have apologies from the CMDR director, Quentin Williams, who is on writing leave, which we're very glad about for his sake. So yes, we're welcoming Marcus Grohmann, who I've known for a while and is a friend of the centre's actually. He's attended a few of our events from Stellenbosch University. And Marcus has his PhD in reconciliation studies from the University of Jena, Germany, while at the same time being affiliated with Stellenbosch University. He holds a BA and MA degree in African Studies with majors in cultural anthropology and development sociology from the University of Bayreuth in Germany. And at the moment, Marcus is a postdoctoral researcher at the Bayes Nordia Center for Public Theology at Stellenbosch University. And his dissertation was published as Seeking Reconciliation in a Context of Coloniality, a study of white people's approaches in a multicultural South African church. So we are really looking forward to your presentation today, Marcus, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a very nice to be back here, PwC and CMDR, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to meet you today and engage with you. I've had the privilege of living in South Africa since 2016. As Robin just said, my PhD was in critical reconciliation research, and in my study on how white people in specific multicultural church in Cape Town worked for reconciliation, why they found themselves in the context that they were dominated culturally. My focus was very much on language use, and epistemologies and theologies arising out of those. It was an ethnographic study that was based in a constructivist research paradigm, and part of the research project was the learning of isiXhosa in relationship-based manner, and it led to a subsidiary study in a Xhosa speaking church in Langa. And it was, so my main research site was an evangelical suburban church, and then I had a so-called African Indigenous church with St. John's denomination in Langa. As Robert said, my background is mainly in anthropology, but now as a social science researcher, I'm part of the theological faculty in Stellenbosch. I found it a very fruitful and exciting interaction, and part of the Bayes Nordia Center for Public Theology. And my current work is mainly in the field of intercultural theology and the anthropology of Christianity. Now, the topic today is escaping the limitations of English, leveraging linguistic diversity among teams of researchers. We who are involved with research in linguistics and multilingualism, I think we all share we share the knowledge of the fact, the necessity and the potential of multilingualism and cultural linguistic diversity. We also know of its importance for social cohesion and for epistemic justice. Our research is often concerned with theorizing multilingualism and with analyzing debates, be it on a societal level or in academia or on a community level. And we work towards increasing understanding and enabling ways people can make use of their various registers and their cultural linguistic resources for their own benefit, but that of wider society as well. Now today, I would like to ask the question, if we take constructivism seriously, if we take our awareness seriously that our social world that we live in is constructed, that we perceive it in certain ways, we respond to it, and together we build it and make sense of it. If we take that seriously, what does the the awareness of an ecology of knowledges, that is, knowledge in the plural, mean for us in the research process, especially if we find ourselves in collaborative research contexts with teams that are made up of people from various cultural linguistic backgrounds. And I suppose among you there's already reflection going on that, and perhaps there are best practices, and I'd be keen to learn more about these. But now in the first part of the seminar, I'd like to share my own questions in this regard, questions that were raised from my own research background. And I'd like to propose certain I'd like to share some ideas as well, how to navigate and leverage cultural linguistic diversity in the research process and invite to conversation. And I hope that in the end there will be something to learn from you, but also for myself. So I hope it's going to be fruitful for all of us together. I'd like to start with speaking briefly about the theoretical foundations that I work from. And for time's sake, I'll just give you some bullet points. Suppose some of the things that are known in this center. So a couple of concepts that have become important to me over the last couple of years. One is the concept of lingua culture. Lingua culture is coined by the linguistic anthropologist Michael Agger. And lingua culture, this awkward, deliberately awkward term, describes what Agger called the necessary tie between language and culture. And with culture, he means the way we perceive reality, we respond to it, we inhabit reality. So how we live our lives and how we do language is connected. Second aspect, from cultural linguistics, and I draw on the work of the late Iranian linguist Fazad Sharifian, who founded the discipline of cultural linguistics, and he speaks a lot about cultural conceptualizations that he uses to see what is going on a cognitive level in people, but not individually, but on a group setting. And he says there is certain what makes what defines us as he often talks of speech communities, but you could also call it groups of people that are united by certain shared ideas or concepts. He calls these cultural conceptualizations, and what I find important here is that he is able to draw loose boundaries to talk about certain speech communities that are different from others by speaking about a heterogeneous distribution of the cultural conceptualizations. So it means that people may know certain metaphors, or they may be familiar with certain ways of speaking, and they share these, but it doesn't mean that everyone who's part of the speech community shares them to the same extent. He says people can be more or less representative of their speech communities. Another foundation that I find important is the epistemologies of the South by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and something that I retain here is his clear descriptions how Western secular scientific knowledge is limited and there is other knowledge beyond that. I dabble a little bit in Bugi Wathiamo's work and his speaking of language as a cultural memory bank, and also, very importantly, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, a Brazilian anthropologist and a representative of perspectivist anthropology, who wrote about the difficulty of translation because contexts that languages are associated with differ. And he highlights the need for translation to bring about the difference and not the similarity, because the similarity in this view is an illusion. What do I take away from these various theories? First of all, languages aren't abstract systems, but languaging is a cultural phenomenon, so it's something very familiar to you. Also, language is always linked to contexts, be it historical, social, epistemological, ontological, for me in my work, cultural and religious. And the practices and the concepts that are part of how we use language in relation to the context we are familiar with are often transferred if we start using a new language. So I sometimes notice that for me as a German home language speaker, being here in a mainly English, sometimes Afrikaans environment, that I use language in a way that is different from people around here. Just a silly example, I sometimes still get confused when people speak of TV shows. The word show is something also very commonly used in German, but we use it in a slightly different way. It usually refers to something happening on a theatre stage. So it's somehow a contradiction to speak of a TV show. I have to think about, okay, what do they now mean if they say that? So when we start using words of a different language, we learn a different language, we often transfer our underlying assumptions and semantics, and they don't change automatically just by virtue of us using the words of another language. I've got a 10-year-old daughter, 7-year-old as well, but 10-year-olds recently started to get fascinated by French. First it was Japanese, now it's French. And she discovered some music and then started writing down word lists. First in Japanese, now in French. She just copies words, and then the way she speaks about it is almost as if she's now able to speak French or Japanese. She says, I have to do that because if I go to Japan one day, I have to be able to speak Japanese. And there isn't any concept yet of the fact that she isn't copying equivalents. It's just different ways of expressing things, but the context is also different, so it should likely be understood in a different way. Okay. So language and words don't express abstract or universal concepts, since these are themselves rooted in certain context or in culture. And this presents a big challenge for translation, because in translation, context gets usually lost. And perspectivism means that translation will always be relational, will be relating to an original context and to a target context. And we have to find ways to take the various contexts into account. How did I deal with the challenge of translation in my own PhD work? I mentioned earlier that part of the project was learning Xhosa and spending time, besides the extensive time I spent in an English-speaking evangelical multicultural church, I spent time as well in a Xhosa-speaking church in Kansha. And from that engagement with this Xhosa-speaking church emerged three terms, three concepts that were of relevance to my other research context as well, where I wanted to demonstrate what cultural dominance can look like. And so the three terms that I then decided to research a little bit further were to preach, to pray, and to get married. And I met with 4 Xhosa home language speakers, and I had a conversation with them individually, what the meanings were for them associated with Uthandaza, Ushumaya, and Uchato. And in this way I explored how they, within their language, their cultural linguistic framework, thought about these concepts. And then I analyzed the data in Xhosa, and then I started writing about my analysis in English. And in this way I was able to, so I basically gave a white European perspective on what I was perceiving, with the intention to show that to the community of white people that I was doing research with, and to help them see that when they speak of what is the, example, what's the right way to preach, or what is the right way to pray, that this is not a universal concept, that this can look very differently in a different cultural context. And that they are not using equivalents when they do translation. Now, in the research process, I was then required by my supervisors to introduce a way of verification of the various translations that I had made, because I had, in my dissertation, I used a number of quotes from the original Isitosa-based conversations. I translated them into, and they wanted me to verify these translations with Isitosa language speakers. And this gave me some headache, because I was aware of my theoretical foundations and the contextual nature of language and perspectivism, and I thought, okay, but my intention is to give a European perspective on what I was seeing in this African context. So it doesn't feel methodologically right to have a Xhosa person verify what I was trying to communicate to the white English speakers. So what I did instead, I found some other people, some other white South Africans who were Xhosa speakers, and had them look over my translation and give me the go-ahead. And yeah, this way I was able to do justice to my own conviction that translation is not universal perspective. What are now the implications for research in general that I'm seeing and that are raised from this research experience? If we take into account the contextual nature of language and this perspectival nature of translation, the following questions I think are raised for research by teams that are made up of collaborators from different cultural linguistic backgrounds. Firstly, how universal are the concepts investigated? To what extent do they reflect a particular cultural linguistic or epistemic approach or perspective? So, how universal are the concepts that we investigate? Secondly, what languages do we gather the data in? And if we gather it in different languages, what happens to the data after the data gathered? An example, I don't know whether you're familiar with the South African Reconciliation Barometer. Every 5 years, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa produces a big study. I think this year the next one is due, or maybe it was last year. They do a study across the whole of South Africa with probably thousands of people, and they try to quantify and to measure the state of post-apartheid reconciliation and what it means to people today in this current setting. So they ask them a lot of questions. What do they associate reconciliation with? How far do you think we have progressed, or have we regressed? And it's quite comprehensive. And what I like about their methodology is that they do interview people in their preferred languages. What I struggle with is what they do with the data afterwards. Because they then, to my knowledge, they then translate the data that was gathered into English, and they homogenize their data, and then they take the data as being like different words or concepts used as equivalents of each other, and they present them in a unified way. So if someone then said in Sotho, reconciliation is associated, say, with justice, or with affordable housing and so forth, or with whatever, it's the contextual nature and the associations of these words for the people, they fall away. And if someone I think it's particularly problematic for those, say, those in South Africa who are not familiar with African language contexts, but they then read the findings as if they were said by English speakers, by English first language speakers. So, is the data that we gather translated? Is it in this way universalized? Or is it analyzed in the original languages? And who's doing the analysis? Are they mother tongue speakers? Are they additional language speakers? What is their level of understanding of original and target context? And lastly, what's the research objective? Whose perspective do we want to foreground? If in this case, the South African reconciliation variant is clearly, obviously I'm aware English is the lingua franca that people use. I'm using that in my presentation in this room. But still, what do we do with the perspectives that were there outside of English, with the knowledge outside of English? Does it get any attention or not? For example, in the publications that are going to be introduced. Are we even aware of these perspectives, or also say of this bias? And in the last part of my short presentation now, I'd like to think with you about how this bias or these perspectives could potentially be made fruitful for the research process. And what I'm going to share with you is something that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment as I'm in the process of conceptualizing a new research project. I won't go into the details of the project itself because it's going to be big and interdisciplinary and multifaceted. But one section of the project, I want to use a methodology that tries to do more justice to the challenges that I've just presented. I will ask, well, let me give you a little bit of background. So a lot of my research happens in the context of evangelical Christians in South Africa and in Western countries. And I see that especially in South Africa, there's a lot of skepticism by evangelical and mainline churches towards churches that are firmly rooted in African traditions like Amazioni, the Zionist churches. Because the fear is they are rooted in their traditions to such an extent that they dilute Christianity or Christian belief or Christian theology and we deal with. It ends up in syncretism, which is in their eyes illegitimate. But there are some evangelicals in South Africa that do work with Amazioni in different ways. For example, teaching. I myself am part of an informal Bible school in Khayelitsha that teaches or provides some very basic foundational theological education to leaders in Zion churches. Over the course of 4 years, they get certified for that, or certificates for that. And there is other such communities in South Africa where we have a very vibrant interaction between evangelicals and Amazioni. So the research question in this little subsection of the research project will be what attitudes towards Zionists do evangelicals have who work with them, who collaborate with them. And here's the methodology that I want to propose and that I'd like your comments on later. So it's going to be ethnographic, so there will be part of participant observation and part will be more interview or conversation based. And my idea is to have on the one hand a researcher, maybe a small team of researchers, who are rooted in Western epistemic traditions. You may call them white people, it doesn't matter. But they are not rooted in African epistemic traditions, but they have some knowledge of this class. So they would do research with the white evangelicals who are involved with the Zionists. And then there would be a COSA or a small team of COSA researchers, perhaps anthropologists, who work with the COSA evangelicals working with the Zionists and who do research with them or on them. And And both groups of researchers gather data, analyze data in the languages, one in English, one in Xhosa, and they write a report or a paper in these two languages. Then, the next step, the two teams of researchers will engage with the findings of the other group. So we need some English-speaking Western epistemology-rooted researchers who have some knowledge in Xhosa and are able to study what the other team has found in that language. Likewise, we have Xhosa researchers who will then engage with the English findings. And they will engage it and process it, and different questions will be asked, and then out of the interaction will result a second paper on each side. So that the overall result will be 2 papers produced in English, 2 papers in Xhosa, and which would allow to keep the contextual knowledge in each language and research setting. And I would like to do it in this way because it would, in my eyes, be a move away from the hegemony of English and from Eurocentric epistemology. A question I still have in this regard is obviously the research methodology as such, because I'm aware that ethnographic research also has Eurocentric traditions. So we may still have to work on how to do more justice to maybe different methodologies that might be out there. But overall, I would see that as a move towards more epistemic justice, and it would result in a more profound and multifaceted presentation of research findings. And in this way, we would do something to counter the illusion of universalism that is often there if we just amalgamate everything and present everything in English and give up some of the contextual knowledge that was there. This is, for now, the end of my presentation, and I would like to invite you to comment on whatever I've presented, but specifically, I'd also like to hear your opinion and your thoughts on the methodology that I shared about in the end. Thank you very much.